cold in this house.
Live stream. Now it should be working. Is it working?
Yes,
Someone?
you're good.
Let me copy the streaming link and okay, I see some people are joining. I don't know if everyone can hear me, but we're gonna get started soon, so give it a few minutes. Okay, I sent the stream link. Is that all you need to post from them?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and disable talking. Is there anything else y'all needed to mention? Salam, Eritrea, or Foman? Or I just make y'all attendees?
That's good.
I think we're gonna get started in like at 11:05 my time, so like I'm gonna give it about 4 to 5 minutes, maybe. We'll see, because people are starting to come in.
If you want go wash, now what are you go use? If you want cook soup, now what are you go use? If your head is hot, now what are kukulam? Tomo bandagba omi lo ma lo. If your child dey grow, water him go use. If water kill your child, now water you go use. No, no, no. To me back mama when omi no lo ma lo. Go so want to le shake, ko ma lo mi o. Nothing without water. Go so want to le shake, ko ma lo mi o. They talk of black man power. They talk of black power. I say, water no get enemy. If you fight them unless you won't die. I say water no get enemy. I say water no get enemy. Oh me you love
Los Angeles. That's cool. Welcome, everyone. People are still joining, so keep waiting for a bit. Let me check the song. This is a like, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name. TV is like this playlist. Oh shoot. Sorry, that was an accident.
This rhythm is called cognitive.
Okay, is Salome still there?
Are
you there? If so, we can go ahead and get started.
In my
I'm
hometown,
here.
Abeokuta
Okay,
City.
cool. So let me. Can y'all stop hearing the music? Hopefully it paused.
Yeah, it's gone.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to one of our very first events through HOA PALS. The event today, we'll talk about it a bit more, but we're joined by two incredible panelists here, which y'all will get to know, and we'll be discussing and bringing in some nuanced perspectives on this title right here, African Problems, African Solutions, a conversation on policing in African states. So before we get started, we'd love to bring in some context as to what we're talking about when we say African problems, African solutions, and who am I, as well as what organization is in charge of this today. So the organization is HOA PALS. It stands for Horn of Africa, Pan-Africans for Liberation and Solidarity. My name is Yolian, and I use she, her pronouns. I am originally, I'm a student at UNT, the University of North Texas, and I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation today. PALS is an organization that was created just a few months ago, actually. A lot of leftists, whether they're in the diaspora or not, have been kind of struggling to find a space where we can have these really candid conversations and present a perspective that is a lot more nuanced than what we see in the mainstream today. And today, along with what our organization aims to do every day, is to use political education to equip members of our community in the diaspora and the Horn of Africa to compassionately and unselfishly serve the people. And what we're doing is trying to build a platform that will challenge us all to learn about issues facing the Horn of Africa and beyond with a Pan-Africanist, anti-imperialist, Black internationalist lens, and of course, to unlearn liberal ideology. And if you have any questions about that, stick around and we can definitely get connected with you all if you're interested in potentially joining or becoming a member. But as for today, we're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists who we have here. First, we're going to start with Salome. If you would like to introduce yourself real quick.
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Salome, and I guess the best words to describe myself is a scholar organizer. I'm really interested in seeing the interconnectedness between what we read, how we practice, and how our practices is also like the relationship between practice and theory, which is called praxis. And so seeing how that manifests, and also working with folks to unlearn and relearn and continuously cultivate new ways of being and cultivate new worlds outside of these structures. Currently, I am a moderator for the reading group of the Decolonial Feminist Collective. This is a group of organizers, researchers, and scholars across disciplines, utilizing decolonial approaches to movement building strategies, research, and publishing. And so that's where I do a lot of the work around really thinking about decolonial feminisms. But yeah, that's a little bit about me. My Twitter is 20_something. If y'all want to follow me, I just be posting random stuff.
We love to see it. Thank you, Salome. So excited for her to also be speaking on and giving us perspective on what's happening in Uganda. But now we also have Socrates Mbamalu. He's a journalist, and I'd love for him to tell us a little bit about him.
Thank you, Yolian. My name is Socrates, and I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, and I grew up in Kenya, currently live in Nigeria. I've been in Nigeria for the past, I think, 12 to 13 years. And I follow a lot of, I'm very much concerned about what happens in what I'll quantify or qualify as the less covered part of the society, the society where, in quotes, those that wash their hands without water that trickles from the taps kind of society. And I'm very much interested in covering the people whom 1% of inflation kind of thing influences the most, and those who don't seem to make it to the conversation in the mainstream, also partly because I live among them. So I've written for various platforms like Vice, Al Jazeera, but I'm a staff writer with This Is Africa, and I'm also currently working with an organization called Foundation for Investigative Journalism in Nigeria, where we seek to kind of basically tell the stories of corruption in Nigeria and expose what's happening in the country, and hoping that, by telling these stories, that Nigeria becomes a better place to live in and corruption becomes a lesser place to exist in Nigeria. Yeah.
Well, that is incredible. Thank you so much for introducing yourselves, Socrates and Salome. Before we kind of get into what all these really incredible questions, and also a note, as you are all listening to what our incredible panelists have to say today, we will be having a Q&A towards the end. So if you are able, don't hesitate to go ahead and put any and all questions you may have in our Q&A box. And you can be able to see that on your bar, on a screen, wherever you're watching from. You can insert any of your questions there, and we will try our hardest to answer all of them or have our panelists answer them as well. So why the title, African Problems, African Solutions? If many of you are already familiar with what that title has been used for, many times before we have seen this title used in a lot of liberal spaces as a way to say that the problems found or instigated in the continent of Africa must be solved by the government or the state, et cetera, et cetera. But what it doesn't do in many areas is it doesn't provide nuance and say, well, where did these problems initially start from? Creating an aggressive analysis on why these solutions have, these problems have manifested in the first place, and what the solutions look like to the masses and not just to the state. And so a lot of people today, we're going to be talking about whether it's Lagos, Kampala, what this outrage over police brutality has looked like in both of those states in particular, but also across the world. I'd also love everyone to challenge themselves in this space today, that when we're talking about police brutality, we're also going to be talking about a lot of other issues, such as class struggle and why that has to do with the problem of police violence in the first place. Who's affected by police violence? And how do we see these systems of white supremacy, imperialism, and colonization seep into the minds of all people and not just a particular population, which is why we're going to be centering Africa and African states. And that's what we mean by the phrase African problems, African solutions, because we want an Africa for and by Africans and not necessarily utilized by other imperialist forces. So hopefully that gives you all a better perspective on why we used that title today and what we're going to be talking about. So first, before we get on to the questions, we'd love both for Salome and Socrates to kind of explain and give context to the particular situation of police violence in their state. So first, we're going to start with Uganda, and I'm going to let Salome take it away.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction and grounding. And also thank you to all of the organizers for cultivating this space and inviting me to be part of it. This space created by the HOA PALS collective through the reading groups and also public facing events like this is an important piece of the long history of Africans, both on the continent and beyond, joining together or grounding, as Walter Rodney would say, to learn with and organize with one another. For my initial comments and presentation, I mainly be outlining the history of policing in Uganda to ground us. During the Q&A, I'll draw more detailed connections to the current state repression in regards to the upcoming elections and Museveni's regime. I come to this work with the acknowledgement of what the revolutionary fighter Assata Shakur told us in her self-titled 1987 autobiography. In it, she wrote, "No one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes if they know that that knowledge will help set you free." Meaning our schools, the media we consume, and everything around us, especially those living in cities, teach us knowledge relevant to maintaining systems of domination such as capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Knowing that truth allows us to question, think critically, and cultivate new possibilities and ways of being, many of which simply return to the ways of being that have been stolen from many of our ancestors. Again, I appreciate the HOA for cultivating this space for so many of us who have needed it, where we can gather, imagine, organize, and relearn. You can change the slide. I'll return to Rodney now to ground our discussion on policing in Uganda. Walter Rodney was a Guyanese historian, academic, and organizer whose work influenced various movements to organize with a meticulous knowledge how Europe's quote-unquote development is a direct result of quote-unquote underdevelopment in Africa. His writings and work were influential and threatened the power of the state, leading to his assassination in 1980. Currently, his family and the people he has touched continue his work through the Walter Rodney Foundation based here in Atlanta, Georgia, and several other methods like reading his 1972 book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. One key element of the book is where Rodney outlines the colonial roots of policing in Africa. An example he gives is the First Cold War, where Britain and Germany were fighting for possession of East Africa. During the war from 1914 to 1918, the British had the King's African Rifles, which were large bodies of troops trained to protect the British Empire throughout the Horn of Africa. Though the King's African Rifle were led by ex-Britain military fighters, most of the soldiers Rodney outlines were Africans. In fact, in 1918, there were 35,000 counted fighters, and 9 out of every 10 of them were Africans fighting for the side of the British. On the German side, there were 3,000 Germans and 11,000 Africans by 1918. Rodney wrote, "Africans were fighting Africans to see which European should rule over them." My questions are this: what encouraged so many Africans to fight for either side? What conditions made it so that this became the reality? And why would Africans fight on the side of any country, Britain or Germany, trying to take and continue possession of them? To attempt to answer these questions, we need to contextualize it within a larger history of policing and militarization in the Horn of Africa, specifically the colonial construct called Uganda. Similar to histories of policing in the US, for those based here, the cultivation of police in Uganda was due to the need for colonizers to extend their power in controlling their quote-unquote subjects, movements, and the state's property. In both the US and Uganda, this meant Black Africans. In 1899, the Uganda Police Force was formed by British colonizers as a paramilitary force under the name Uganda Armed Constabulary. The British love fancy names, meaning the police was an extension of the military, the same military utilized to colonize. The British officers in charge of the Uganda police had experienced policing for British interests in Palestine, Jamaica, Gambia, Nigeria, Kenya, and throughout the British Empire. If I have not made it clear yet, let me explicitly name that the colonial construct called Uganda's police system is based on British colonial rule, and as such, based on British law. The high-ranked officers were all white British, but even if the officers and military aides and those at the top ranks were Black Africans, what would that mean given the roots of policing are based on British law and the interests of the state to protect property? It would simply mean Black Africans protecting colonial power. The police will do what it was cultivated to do, always. No matter how much the people in charge look like you or speak your language, the institution of policing in Uganda was created in response to crime and administrative requirements of the colonial government, not in the interest of the people living there. This is a very function of police. The force was also created to suppress rebellion against the colonial government policies. At the start of the early 1900s, there were clashes in several parts of the country, including the 1907 Amyandira rebellion in Bunyoro, protesting the colonial imposition of Baganda chiefs on Bunyoro, opposition of the growth of cash crops like corn in Angola in early 1903, and the Lamonji rebellion in 1911 in northern Uganda. I say all of this to highlight that at every state of state repression, people fight. Colonial powers know this, and that is why they have police and military to fight opponents of their rule and protect their property. The police state is there to protect property. Its very roots are grounded in capitalist interest, grounded in the exploitation of people for the profit of colonizing powers. It is not in the interest of the people, nor can we make it be in the interest of the people. There is no hope in the police state. And so that is why we must create new worlds and ways of being outside of those systems. In the case of Uganda, cash crops like cotton are not there for the interest of the people. It is there so that the British can exploit them for their labor and profit off of that. From the time of colonization beyond, the job of military and police is to maintain the flow of capitalism and dominance. In Uganda, between 1930 and 1940, there were increased political pressure and rebellion against colonialism. Thus, the police was involved in suppressing strikes, tax evasions, riots, rebellions in areas of Acholi, Higazi, Baganda, Buguzi, and several others. You can change the slide. I'm gonna turn now to Frantz Fanon, and of course I gotta take a drink of water before I do that. But psychiatrist and philosopher Frantz Fanon, in writing about violence. In capitalist countries, a multitude of moral teachers, counselors, and bewilderers separate the exploited from those in power. In the colonial countries, the contrary, the policeman, the soldier, by their immediate presence and their frequent and direct action, maintain contact with the native and advise him by means of rifle butts and wampum not to budge. It is obvious here that the agents of government speak the language of pure force, even by their very presence and existence. In this way, we can start to redefine the meaning of violence. The state in itself, its existence, is violence. The violence manifests in continuous wars, in hunger, in patriarchal violence, and in literal killing of people. Understanding systemic dominance in the ways it materially manifests as violence allows us to rethink the position of protesters, or quote unquote, what some media outlets say, looters, and all those responding to state repression. Redefining violence allows us to see the myriad ways it manifests, not only through the police and military, but through the very existence of the systems, including the law. In her recently released publication entitled Afrofeminism and Decolonization, Dr. Sylvia Tamale argues that modern law in African contexts is a product of colonialism, not necessarily as a way to negate the weaponry that went into the colonial project, but more so to show the civilizing mission of the British legal systems, along with police in Africa. One of the ways this manifested is the very cultivation of what we now call Uganda. The transition of multiple ethnicities, including Baganda, Lango, Busaga, and Buganda from multiple communities with varying social orders and trade. For one example, Acholi folks whose land transcends the borders of Uganda and the borders of South Sudan, turned into a single nation state called Uganda through violent British rule. Dr. Tamale points to the ways in which colonists set up local courts administered by chiefs and headmen to enforce traditional justice, which they baptized customary law. The French, for example, explicitly decreed that customary law was only to be applicable if it was contrary to the principles of French civilization. It would also be inapplicable if it was incompatible with any written law. Many African legal systems, including Uganda, still carry variants of this repugnancy test that hierarchizes the pluralistic system that the law to this day. It is clear that the justice and morality to which customary law had to defer were based on colonial standards. It is therefore mind-boggling to think that many quote-unquote independent African states still carry this racist test for assessing the validity of their customary norms and practices. Uganda's first constitution of 1962, which is not much different than its current constitution, states that the role and purpose of the police is for the prevention and detection of crime, the apprehension of offenders, the preservation of law and order, the protection of property, and the due enforcement of all laws and regulations, and as a military force, discharge military duties. That is the job of the police. The job of the police is the job of the military. The job of the military is the job of the state. Law and order in this case is law and order of the British colony. The law is based on British law. The country of Uganda is cultivated as British colony. So therefore anything connected to that, whether it be the police, elected officials, et cetera, will be grounded on that foundation whose roots are in colonialism. So just to jump from independence to Museveni, the police and politics of colonial construct called Uganda are very interconnected, as y'all have seen, even after quote unquote independence from Britain. Much of the same institutions remain in almost every president in Uganda, from Milton Obote to Idi Amin to Museveni, have been by military force. And I'll stick to two examples relating to Museveni's Acholi genocide backed by the US. And each of these examples were sourced through Pambazuka News. But if you want to learn more, look up The Brilliant Genocide on YouTube and search Museveni Acholi genocide. So the first example is during Museveni's 34-year rule since 1986, his army drove 90% of Acholi people into refugee camps where many died of starvation, disease, and self-harm. Though Museveni justified the refugee camps by claiming he was protecting the Acholi from the LRA. Secondly, in October 2011, our very own President Obama sent 100 US Special Operations Forces into Uganda's northern region to, he said, help the Ugandan army protect the people by hunting down Joseph Kony, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army, commonly known by its acronym LRA. Now, however, many Acholi and other indigenous groups of northern Uganda say that Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni attempt to evict them from their lands is what really threatens their survival. These contradictions are shown in the documentary A Brilliant Genocide. I'll broadcast a snippet of it to end my portion. And just content, the documentary is about Acholi genocide carried out by Museveni. So if you don't want to watch it, I recommend changing your screen for 5 minutes and maybe turning down your volume for 5 minutes. But if you do watch it, there is a portion in the video where they show a blurred out naked dead Black body, and I'll give a forewarning by voicing it right before they show it. I think they show it for maybe 3 seconds. You can play it. I don't hear it.
So sorry. Go to my share. It should say share computer sound. Okay. Can anyone hear that? No? Okay. This was working earlier. Okay, let me share it once again with computer sound. Okay.
In Rwanda during the massacres, where people actually saw the visuals, the images of people being chopped by machetes, you could see the blood flowing. In Acholi, it was quite different. You could not see the blood flowing. So even though it was committed in broad daylight, you really couldn't see it. People died in a different way. They died through plant neglect. No food, no hydration, no medical health care, lack of sanitation, sexual violence from the soldiers who were meant to protect them. That's why this was a brilliant genocide, a silent genocide, perfect crime.
The Western government who stood by Museveni, who supported him, who sponsored him, who became his advocates, provided him with a lot of money, they knew full well who Museveni was and is, what Museveni's regime was doing. They didn't want to see any evil. They didn't want to hear about any evil, but they knew about the evil.
We will never be able to bring back the dead to life. We will never be able to restore everything that was destroyed by the soldiers acting with impunity.
You can continue playing it.
Oh, okay.
What about we who are the victims? Some of us, we've lost members of my family. I lost about 6 members of my family, including my brothers, my cousins. Nobody talks about them. And they were not political people. These were people who were in a village.
Simply ending hostilities and moving forward without reckoning with the past doesn't guarantee peace. It's only making people confront what has happened and and forcing them to say this won't happen again and holding those who are responsible to account, that's the way that you ensure peace. And that's the way you provide justice for people who've lost so much.
It was very difficult for me to see and to accept that the same people with whom I worked had such an incredible blind spot when it came to the land of my birth, and were prepared essentially to say that my people are dispensable. Very, very sad, very painful.
Because of his misrule, so many Africans have lost their lives, and yet you treat it as if it's not a big issue. Then that's a clear indication to everybody about the value that you attach to the lives of Africans. And there's no other way to see it. The crimes committed against people in Uganda, in Central Africa, would not be tolerated if it was being committed against Europeans. And that's what it boils down to. It's a sad testament, but it's the absolute truth.
Thank you for sharing that video. And sorry, y'all, for not giving the forewarning. It came faster than I had suspected. But that concludes my portion. And of course, there'll be more conversation around this in the Q&A.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Salome, for providing an incredible framework and background and context to what's happening specifically in Uganda, but all of these states and the same problems that persist throughout the continent. So Socrates, now if you can kind of also provide some context and background to the NSARS movement, but also Nigeria in general.
Thank you, Yoli. Salome has done a brilliant job, I must confess. And I hope I can I can match up to the brilliant presentation she has given. Nigeria is, I'm able to process Nigeria from two ways, sometimes as an outsider and sometimes as an insider. And this is because I grew up in Kenya for 10 years, came back to Nigeria when I was 15, and I've lived in Nigeria for the past 12 years. My parents are Nigerians, and so there is that sort of way in which I can distance myself a bit and clearly see the Nigerian state for what it is. And for many, the Nigerian state is, like many other African states, started as a colonial project, started more as an economic project, under Goldie and in a company currently known as USC, and it was called the Niger Company, and the Niger Company eventually was bought by the British government, and basically what you have in East Africa, where you have the East Africa British Company, and things like that. It was the same in Nigeria, and it was also the same in Congo when you also look at the private companies that took over certain parts of the continent. And the aim of most of these companies was basically economic. And to secure the economic interests, most of these companies basically came with forces of their own, either force publique or whatever other company, other security apparatus that they brought with them. In Nigeria, 1896, there was the bombing of Lagos, the annexing of Lagos, where Lagos was bombarded, and basically despite the resistance that was given and a lot of politics at play, Lagos was conquered. There was what you call the sacking of the Benin Empire, where the Benin Empire were. In fact, I think most of the history that is talked about many times doesn't capture the brutality that happened. We mask it under these terms of the Lagos conquering or whatever, you know, and we don't go into the details of what really happened at that time in those cities. Because in Benin, for example, what happened was that Benin was basically brought down. The Benin kingdom was brought down. The Oba's castle, or the king's palace was sacked. And you know, I mean, in African culture and African context, what it means for a king's palace to be sacked means that everything must have been totally brought to leveled down totally. Nobody to defend anything, you know. And we don't really talk about how much brutality must have taken place by the British for them to have taken away, cutted away the artifacts we see in the British Museum currently. And most of these artifacts that they took away were what were in the king's palace. And of course, they must have been of specific dimensions or of specific standard. And that was one of the ways in which we see brutality taking place in the context of Nigeria. In northern Nigeria, there was brutality that took place. The little resistance that was given by northern Nigeria was squashed, basically. In Enugu, there's what is called as the Evil Valley Massacre, where the workers who worked in the coal mines were basically massacred. I think this was in 1947 thereabouts, because of their protests against the British. There is the 1929 Aba women riots, of which many historians have even contested using the term riots, because riots seems to depict those women in a certain way. But the brutality that came from what happened basically came from the British. And those women, it wasn't what we seem to qualify as, you know, you just go to your houses and everything will be peaceful. No, I mean, people were killed. The women stood their ground because they were taxed, you know, and this was something they were kicking against. You know, and these are incidents, these are events that took place across many parts of Africa. People protesting for their rights, people protesting for their dignity, and those dignities basically being squashed in various ways. In Kenya, we saw that in so many ways, whether it was the British fighting against the Nandi resistance, 1896 up to 1905 thereabouts, where the Nandis basically resisted the British coming to their lands, either by taking away the railway line, the steel irons that were used to build the railway lines across their roads, you know, such things, such little resistances. You know, we can talk about South Africa where all these things happen. But this doesn't remove from the fact that when it comes to the issue of brutality, it was the British who first laid the pipelines of that. It was the colonialists who laid the pipelines of that. And I sometimes read a lot about Congo, and especially in Congo, there's no way we can quantify how that happened, especially. In Congo, to go to the rubber plantation was almost a death sentence. If you come without the right quota, your family is killed. There is this picture of this man who is looking down at the feet and hands of his daughter. He has come back from a rubber plantation. He's not able to meet the quota. His name is called Nsala. And because of that, the hands and feet of his 5-year-old daughter are cut off. And he's there looking despondent. And when I followed through the story, I heard his wife had also been killed. And these are the brutalities that happened either in sugarcane plantations, either in Tanzania, or in sisal plantations, either in Tanzania, or in various other plantations across the continent, because these plantations basically were serving an economic purpose for Western European states. Now, Salome has already laid a very good ground about what happened in Uganda. That ground is similar to what happened in Nigeria. Whether it was direct rule, whether it was indirect rule, that is irrelevant, because the presence of the colonial powers in Africa was not by choice. This evening, actually, even before this presentation, I was talking to someone, and he comes from the line, and many Nigerians who are here would know, he's talking of the line, he came from the line of someone who is called Jaja of Opobo. So Jaja of Opobo was a king in the Niger Delta who used to sell palm oil. And he used to export palm oil directly to Liverpool before the British came. And when eventually things started, the British colonization started taking place in Nigeria, he was taken into exile, and that trade was cut off. And with it came a lot of, with it eventually came the replacement of the palm oil trade with slave trade and so many other things, you know, that come with that along the coastal areas are seen across many parts of Africa, of which most of the coastal areas in Africa served as exit grounds for many of slaves who were captured. And I was talking with him today, and we were talking about the Niger Delta. And when you look at how Jaja of Opobo, his trade was stopped, how he was taken into exile into Equatorial Guinea, and you look at the current state of the Niger Delta in Nigeria, the violence that has basically rippled and gone through the whole of Niger Delta in Nigeria, it is definitely unquantifiable. And all this leads to a violence for the securement of economic purposes, which obviously the formation of states, Nigeria as a state, Uganda as a state, Kenya as a state, secured also by African intellectuals, in quotes, who protect interests of the same colonial people, colonial rulers, continues up to now. So when we talk about EndSARS, where does EndSARS really start from? If we were to trace the original roots of EndSARS, do we start from the formation of the police, or do we start from the formation of the colonial state called Nigeria? And if we're starting from the formation of the colonial state called Nigeria, from the formation of the colonial state called Kenya, called Uganda, then we start understanding that as a continent, the major objective, and going back to the Berlin Conference, the major objective was economic purposes. And you come back and you start seeing and start connecting the dots. Economically, where is Africa? What does Africa serve? What purpose does Africa serve till now? We have been complaining about, or we have been talking about Congo since the time of Leopold II. We're still talking about Congo 2020. What has changed? Is it only time? Is it only devices that have changed? What has really changed? You know, and then, so when you come to Nigeria and you're talking about EndSARS, SARS, Special Anti-Robbery Squad, was formed in the 1990s, of course, an offshoot of the Nigerian police to fight crime and all that. We basically understand that. But as many things Nigeria, and when you start looking at Nigeria, especially Nigeria itself, specifically as a country, where in the 60s, you look, the first coup takes place, and almost 12 coups have taken place in Nigeria alone. Nigeria as a country has experienced more than 4 decades of military rule. And that military rule was basically to serve a specific purpose, because as Fela would sing, military rule will never take place in Britain. And Fela teaches, when he says, "Teacher, don't teach me nonsense," he's basically talking about that. He talks about the British teach you these things, but the British will never teach you what you are doing to take place in their own land. The British will never support military taking over their own country. The military will never take over the state in Britain, but they will support the military taking over states in Africa, in Nigeria. And so there comes the military rule in Nigeria. And first and foremost, we must understand the dichotomy of Nigeria, Northern Nigeria, Southern Nigeria. you can understand also that Northern Nigeria, how Northern Nigeria functioned was different from how Southern Nigeria functioned. And you must understand also that the end product, or what the British wanted in Northern Nigeria, or as they were living, just like they did in every other part of Africa, was also to live securing their investment in some sort of ways. And securing that investment meant putting people in charge who could continue doing their will. And just like today, I was talking with my friend, and I told him, when you look at Kenyatta, Jomo Kenyatta, for example, Jomo Kenyatta was basically still serving the purpose of colonialism, what we call neocolonialism. And it was basically such that even when the British left, they still had the land intact, because it was part of the deal they signed, you know, and this continues in all African states. And when you look at what the state was, and I majorly usually question the myth of founding fathers. Who are founding fathers really? And we find that founding fathers is just something we take from the West, from America, and we uphold it so much in African states and celebrate these so-called founding fathers without questioning their legacy first and foremost. And by the time you start questioning their legacy, you start understanding that you are dismantling something. Because understanding that these founding fathers actually were used as puppets to uphold the state in some way. And by upholding that state, it meant you continue the crimes. So therefore, someone like, Nigeria happens as a state, independence comes, we come with a flag, we come with a national anthem, we come with a national pledge in a country that has over 600 ethnic groups. How does that make sense? And because you have to secure this land, you therefore form a force, the army, the air force, the navy, the police. And because these police have to secure the GRAs, you know, the reserved areas, which are mostly occupied by colonialists, you know, securing their property. And in the context of Nigeria, that wasn't even a settler state, because in settler states, it was worse. And in Nigeria, where it wasn't a settler state, you start seeing the fact that the police serve this particular function, you know, of securing the GRS. The black man shouldn't, or the African shouldn't go towards these areas. You are not supposed to walk this way. And you have laws also that that also portray this kind of thing. No loitering. What is loitering? And Keji talks about loitering as resistance. You know, because you look at loitering and you start asking yourself, walking around my street, do I consider this as loitering? But loitering was what the British, was what the colonialists came up with to signify that they don't see anybody of your skin color, of my skin color, walking around this area in a reserved area. And you continue. Oh, so Yolian, do you have something to say?
No, I actually said you've been providing really great points and starting to actually answer some of the questions that we have. So would it be okay if we go ahead and just get into the questions?
Yes, please. Yes,
okay,
please.
Great. Thank you so much, both Salome and Socrates, for providing really great historical context to the situation that we're talking about today. So actually, in this case, when we were talking about Nigeria and Uganda, it has always been viewed as states that are like wildly like hailed by Western media in one narrative, but then portrayed differently in many other ways, depending on kind of what the political purpose the media has to serve at that point in time. I would love for y'all to kind of answer maybe how, a little bit already kind of started, how did EndSARS and the end police brutality in Uganda start, but what was like the triggering point, and how can you kind of talk a little bit about if there's a pattern, because we see these problems happen and then we see like every few years it kind of like gets pretty big and it blows up on either social media or many media platforms. What does that look like from the media's perspective, as y'all may have seen or researched? Salome, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll start with the first question about kind of how Stop Police Brutality Uganda started. So Uganda is set for elections in January 2021, and the seat for president, which has held by Museveni since 1986, even though elections keep happening each time there's an election, there is ceasefire, which is, so he's been in office for 34 years, which is before most of us, I think, were even born or were a thought. And he's always led with state violence and repression. So the hashtag Stop Police Brutality Uganda, when I first saw it, was on Twitter on November 18th. And this happened because it started happening because Museveni sent his police to arrest one of his main contenders, Bobby Wine. And the reason they gave for the arrest was that Bobby Wine was holding an event with too many people gathered, making it a safety concern over the spread of COVID-19. But there's like a lot of disconnects to that, because first, like the cry that, you know, you're going to cause COVID-19 deaths does not necessarily make sense, especially considering that these arrests have led to the police killing 50 people, which is 25% of the reported total COVID deaths in Uganda since the start of the virus. We all know the discrepancies with, of course, reporting, but nonetheless, Museveni's measures are based off of those official results. And second, despite attracting similar large crowds, Museveni's party, which is the National Resistance Movement, they had events going on in Gulu and in another town, and those did not go uninterrupted, even though they also had crowds. As mentioned before, the military is there to protect Museveni, and the police is there to protect Museveni. The military and the police, whether I say military or police, it means really the same thing within this context. And Museveni's interest and the colonial interest is to maintain this power. So he uses the militaries to stifle protests and candidates, and anyone that's a threat to this colonial construct called Uganda is a threat to him. And so he sees Bobby Wine as a threat. So in this way, the state makes the purpose of the police very clear, and that the police, again, are not there to protect you. They're there to protect state interest, and in this case, to make sure that Museveni stays in power.
Thank you for that. That was really great. Thank you for the context. Socrates, how do you answer this?
I think the framing of police brutality in Nigeria, basically, I mean, in regards to EndSARS and what it is, EndSARS has been going on probably for the past 3 years as a hashtag. And of course, Nigerians dominate the internet in some ways, especially Twitter. And and therefore, when it comes to getting hashtags to trend, it happens. So it's happened, I mean, once in a while, where there would be police killings, killings by the police on civilians. But there seemed to be no really outlet about what was happening. You know, so the hashtag came, EndSARS, and I think this was in 2017. And the first time it came, I think the police said, between 2017, basically 2017 and 2020, the Inspector General of Police disbanded SARS up to 4 times. And that seems to be a pattern. And because Nigerians, to be very honest, Nigerians take a lot of bullshit from their government, I'll be very honest. And Nigerians would get that and they would quiet down, and then there will be another killing. And then it happened to people in tech, because Nigeria being what it is, the people in tech would come up tech in Nigeria is big now, and people in tech started complaining, about being harassed. And there was this story that went so viral, and people in tech got angry. I think they would set up funds to do something. I don't know how that ended, but basically it was becoming a menace, and people were starting to look at it as, keep it at the back of their head. I personally have been stopped by the police more than once. The first time I was with a friend who is a poet, and basically because we were young, carrying bags, we had laptops, and we were taken to the police station. Our laptops they basically went through our laptop, to see if there was anything in course incriminating in the laptop. The other time was because we were coming from a mall. And this is what young Nigerians face. If you are driving a good car, it is a problem. If you have an iPhone, it is a problem. If you look good, dressed well, it's a problem. And many Nigerians, would purposely sometimes even leave their phones in the house just not to be stopped by SARS. And eventually, I think there were various trigger points that didn't really spark Nigerians coming to the streets, because you must also understand the culture of protests in Nigeria. And the culture of protests in Nigeria is such that, for example, Nigerians are so used to having people who would use those protests as a platform to enrich themselves into government posts. And therefore, Nigerians didn't trust protests a lot of times. The protest that took place in 2012 against Goodluck Ebele Jonathan regime on the 2nd of January in 2012 was against the increase in fuel and the removal of subsidies. And that was probably the largest protest that had ever taken place in recent times then. And those who led the protest then are those who are currently in power now. So therefore, who are you going to trust to protest? Now, when the EndSARS kept on coming in, going out, coming in, going out, and it became an issue on social media, there was a killing that took place in a place called Ughelli in Delta State. And when that took place, what happened was that there were protests in that particular part, which is in the south part of Nigeria. And it went viral and everybody was angry. So apparently it was said the police had shot someone and taken his car and run away with his car. It was reported later that the person didn't die, but the police took his car. Now, the next 2 days, EndSARS was trending. It only took one person to say, you know what, I'm going to the Lagos State House of Assembly. I'm going to protest. Meet me on the 7th of October. And prior to this, 1st of October is usually Independence Day in Nigeria. But this year it was different. Nigerians were so angry. Buhari had come under the notion of change, bringing change to the people. Buhari was a former military leader who had a bad record in 1984. Somehow, because of lack of history, Nigerians still voted him in 2015. And basically, yes, we were reaping the repercussions of that action. Boko Haram is having a field day up to now. The economy is in shambles. Nothing seems to be in control. It's almost like W.B. Yeats' poem. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things are falling apart. And now, when the 1st of October independence took place, it was so pessimistic. And the government coming with this whole charade of, we are doing this 60-year, whatever they were doing. And Nigerians were so angry. Within that space, this person was shot. Protest started in Ughelli in southern Nigeria, Delta State. And then on the 7th of January, 8th of October, 7th of October, 8th of October, someone said, you know what, let's meet at the Lagos State House of Assembly. And this is basically what led to what became a wide-known protest, the #EndSARS protest. And this was supposed to actually only...
I think you muted yourself.
Am I muted? Oh, okay. Should I continue?
Yes, go ahead. And we're actually about to answer. I don't know if you feel like you wanted anything else.
Yeah, just a bit. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is what basically led to the #EndSARS protest, and it was led by these young women and men who were in their 18-year-olds to 40, 35-year-olds, and who were just tired. And everybody just took to the streets, and this was like the biggest demonstration that has probably taken place in Nigeria. And basically what we see, this global phenomenon that has gone on in Chicago, in London, and in all these parts was just because of what happened with the Nigerian police. And yeah, it has been a long time coming, to be very honest, from 2017 till now.
Thank you so much for that. Those were really great points. And that kind of leads us to the next question. So both of y'all did a good kind of job at analyzing how regular citizens are being affected by this broader systemic issue. So then how would y'all see average citizens viewing the state itself and the institutions surrounding it that answer to poor and working class people? And how do you see that serve their interests? What's the class nature of Nigeria and Uganda? And how is that maybe changed the in terms of like the economic crisis? How has that changed the perception of police over the years, if it at all has? Feel free to respond.
I think so.
Okay.
So in the case of Uganda, like many other colonial structures, Uganda's class divisions are very much interconnected with which ethnicities/groups have had state power and were in closer cahoots with the colonizer body, in this case, the British body. So growth in Uganda today is still measured through the neo-colonial lens of like GDP, Human Development Index, and other tools that measure the countries whose quote unquote underdevelopment is a direct link to overdevelopment of colonizers. Through the people I know living in Uganda, mainly living in the north as opposed to Western Uganda, where the living conditions are quite different. Most folks do not believe state institutions answer to poor and working people's interest. They understand that the state equals the police, which equals the military. And to them, the state means Museveni, the police means Museveni, the military means Museveni. So they rely on each other for substance. And most folks' interactions with the police in Uganda are either harassment for money, to enforce militancy, or to just simply intimidate you with your presence. In my interactions with police in Uganda, it's usually been to take some type of money for whatever thing they want, or to harass, especially coming from, usually when going from up north, which is about 12 hours from Kampala, it's not border check because there's not a border, but they do check your passports and your visas, etc. And that could be very intimidating for folks, especially refugees up north. And so even thinking about what the state has done with the COVID pandemic, which they claim is the reason for arresting Bobi Wine, they've increased transportation costs. There's been, like similar to the rest of the world, there's been increased cases of domestic violence. And most cases in Uganda, of course, do not get reported because the folks, this legal system is not a system that's really cultivated for them. Dr. Tamale mentioned that only 5% of Uganda's population look to formal law systems to quote unquote find justice, which I argue cannot be won through the state anyway, because as we mentioned, all laws are based on Britain law, and Uganda as a country, like most African countries, are a colonial project. And with this project, it lines through, has lines through whole ethnicities, as I mentioned before. And considering the population of Uganda, 77% of the folks are under 30 and 50% are unemployed. But even when we're talking about unemployment rates, we should question employment rates as well, because what does it mean to labor in a colonial construct, especially the type of labor that is counted within these international economic measures, which themselves are products of neocolonialism. So it's always these young people that get arrested, always the people without money that get killed. And with this particular protest, hundreds of people were arrested, 50 people died within 3 days. And when we connect that with a state institution like Parliament, those seats are not claimed by folks without money. Even if they were, it would be under the same colonial structure. So similar to the US, getting into office requires having more money than most of the people you're about to make decisions on behalf of. In Uganda particularly, it costs about $480 million. Not 480 million shillings, which is about 130,000 US dollars to simply run for office, whether or not you get elected, which is violent. And it's also violent. The structure in itself is also violent. And additionally, just in general, most Ugandans cannot afford to live under capitalism, is what we've gathered time and time and time again.
Thank you, Salome. That actually was an incredible point to make. I'm still thinking about how you talked about the structure in and of itself being violent, and because of that, we can't really expect any even access points that are created into the government or the governing body. Like, that access point isn't going to be accessible, for lack of a better word, to poor and working class people, because they're literally the type of people they continue to deny and oppress in so many different ways. Socrates, do you feel like that's the same in Nigeria? And is there any connections you can make there with that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, Salome basically, Africa is not a country, but sometimes you tend to wonder whether we're facing the same things. And Salome's points basically very much stands in Nigeria. The violence against poor people in Nigeria didn't start. Why EndSARS is prominent, let me just start by saying, why EndSARS, the massacre that took place, the Lekki massacre that took place, why it is prominent is because of where it happened. If that same massacre happened somewhere else in Nigeria, it will not get this same attention as it did. There are so many massacres that take place in Nigeria that haven't gotten the same attention. The only reason why this got the same attention is because it took place in a middle-class place in Lagos, Africa's commercial city, to put it in quotes. Because it's Africa's commercial city, this doesn't mean that there are no massacres or no deaths that have taken place in equal measure that have not been covered. Prior to the EndSARS, people who live in the riverine areas in Nigeria have been chased away from their homes by the Navy, the Nigerian Navy. Their homes have been bombarded and they've been chased away. If you look at the history of almost every Nigerian military ruler, if you look at the history of almost every Nigerian president, they have a massacre attached to them. I can start with Gowon, the massacre of the Igbos in the Civil War. I can start with Obasanjo, in as much as he started the so-called the Transparency International. During Obasanjo's tenure, there were two massacres that took place in Odi, and there's another place that I've forgotten the other place, but these massacres happened under his watch and he justified them. Under Yaradua, there's the Baramatu massacre that happened in the Niger Delta. So there's so many massacres that happen in Nigeria that are not covered, either because there are economic angles to it that the Nigerian state is benefiting from and therefore doesn't want to lose, or the people who died are poor. And this very much plays in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, to be poor is a crime. Basically, it is a crime. Because once, for example, and this is what we see also in EndSARS, in the SARS protests, and in SARS also, because when SARS comes, they're asking you to give them 500,000 Naira, for example. I have been to 2 panels now in 2 different states outside of Lagos. Those panels are not receiving the same attention as the EndSARS panel in the judiciary panel in Lagos is receiving. But if you look at the cases that are happening in those panels, there are cases whereby probably this person was in his home, he only has a wife, he's a farmer, he's taken away from his home and kept in prison for more than a year. This person is a beer parlor seller, he's a beer seller, he's taken from his place of work, and he's kept in prison for the next 2 years, charged with armed robbery. And the Nigerian judiciary is part to this criminal enterprise also, because they also don't do their due diligence, in following up these issues. So apart from the Nigerian police, the Nigerian judiciary is also part of it. And you find that class plays a huge role, especially in Nigeria, you come, and Nigeria is a state where you come to, and the first thing you're smelling is power. Right from the immigration officer down to the police, in fact, when you go down to the person that is opening the gate for you of your estate. If you're driving a car that doesn't look good, and even if you live in that estate, they will question you. They would ask, are you part of this estate, And so you look at that and you find that it is actually, unfortunately, very sad that when we talk about people dying, we don't count the poor. We don't tell their stories. And the only reason why EndSARS has gotten this much prominence is because it is the middle class that are leading it and that are involved.
That was an incredible point and perspective to bring into the conversation, and proves even more as to why it's so important that when we do have these conversations about the police state, that we don't leave out class and the nuance that class brings into this conversation. So thank you both for answering that incredibly, which kind of goes into the next question about, from there, do any of y'all see any potential labor movement or any just mass movement organization that either is behind these protests that have been fueled by these protests, or any sort of demands to restructure what we see as like economic arrangements in these states, and how these conversations happened?
In the case of Uganda, it's quite, there's so much repression that it's hard for me to answer that question, but there is one group that I want to highlight whose work I've been noticing and appreciating. A group formed, I don't know how many years ago, but it hasn't been that long. They're called UNESO, UNESO. So it's a national network that brings together all sex worker-led organizations in Uganda, irrespective of their sexual orientation, gender identities, and nationality. If y'all want to look them, they're on Twitter at UNESO Uganda, and I'll put it in the chat when I'm done. But I find this group particularly important because sex work is work, and it's constantly under attack by police and other violent government institutions. And the folks that are working even like under this umbrella, they understand that the state does not protect them. Like the very presence of police is violent to them. And their very existence is against the state and the state's interests. So they take care of each other, particularly when it came to the pandemic. They distributed needs to their members across the country. They also have trainings and other support materials for their members. And so, yeah, I just wanted to highlight that particular group doing work. I'm not saying that they were part of the most recent protests, but they're definitely doing work to take care of each other that's outside of the police state.
Thank you for bringing that up and providing us such a really great example of like organization through like as a way to like fuel these protests. Socrates, for this question in respect to Nigeria, it actually reminds me of, I think, what kind of came up on Twitter one day during these protests, where people had found warehouses full of food and were just like having a party and getting as much as possible. And people were talking about how there were resources and they were like purposefully like kept from people who were poor and starving. And so if this has any connection to your answer as to how this plays a role in movement organization and protests, please do answer that.
I mean, anytime I think of Nigeria, it's one of the most complex places, really, to be honest. When it comes to mass movement, Nigeria actually has a history of mass movement, you know. In the 60s, when the British wanted to send this pact where Nigeria would leave its borders, land and air and sea borders open for the British to come into the country anytime, you know, there were protests against that until the prime minister of the time, the first prime minister of the country, I forget his name, he basically had to stand down. So, I mean, there were protests when Patrice Lumumba was killed in Nigeria. There were protests. So Nigeria has protests has mass movement protests from student organizations to labor organizations. But the military weakened those mass movements, especially the Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida regime. Yeah, Tafawa Balewa was the first prime minister. So during Tafawa Balewa regime, they wanted to bring in the British and give them access to Nigeria's lands and ports in Kaduna and Lagos. So during Babangida's time, he weakened that. He incentivized, basically made corruption a mainstay in Nigeria. And therefore, labor movements, student movements were filled with people who were yes men to the government. And those who stood against the government were basically assassinated. Come down to 2020. In 2012, the Nigerian Labour Congress was partly involved in leading the mass movement that happened then. There's a party called the Labour Party in Nigeria, but has no seemingly recognition to the Labour Party movement in probably other countries in Europe or in Britain or anywhere, because the Labour Party movement in Nigeria also has been taken over by people who have money. So mass movements in Nigeria are highly political in the sense that they are used to antagonize people in power. Before the EndSARS movement, there was supposed to be a mass movement organized by the Nigeria Labour Congress. Nigerians were already getting prepared to protest, and then just a night, like clockwork, and this doesn't happen just once in a while, it's something that Nigerians almost expected. Just like clockwork, Nigerians were told, okay, the Nigerian government has acceded to our demands, so therefore no protests. What this has done is that it has weakened the structure of mass movements in Nigeria over time. Now, coming down to what this has done in relation to protests in Nigeria, the EndSARS protests had nothing to do with, for example, the labor movement. It was totally independent. And this means that it was organized, and because it was organized in such a way that there was no leader, it was very hard for the Nigerian government to curtail it. And because only what happened was that lead your protest in your vicinity, we will send you money either for food or for water, continue leading your protest peacefully. It was so foreign to the Nigerian government that they could not understand what was happening. And this led to them blocking the bank accounts of various individuals in the country. Now, when you come to the fact that, when it comes to the, now when it comes to this protest actually elevating the issue of police brutality, what the EndSARS protest has done, especially because it was not started by the Nigerian Labour Congress, it has shown people that they can organize independent of the Nigerian Labour Congress. And therefore, they don't need to wait for the Nigerian Labour Congress, which seems to have been corrupted. They don't have to wait for it to make any demand, whatsoever. And what this has also led is, in fact, there is actually a possibility that there will be a second wave of EndSARS protests in Nigeria. And this has actually sparked not just police brutality conversation, but the conversation around governance, the conversation around how much are the lawmakers taking home, the conversation around even the unity of Nigeria. Do we have to be together as a country? Do we have to maintain this colonial structure? And these are conversations that would not have happened probably if it took place inside, or if it took place from a mass movement that was controlled by the Nigerian Labour Congress. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the things that are basically happening that are totally different from what was usually the norm. A movement that doesn't seem to have a leader, but is very well coordinated, and which also caters to the people.
That's incredible. Thank you for that. So as just a reminder for everyone, we're going to have the panelists answer just a few more questions and then actually get into the Q&A pretty soon. So there's incredible discussion being had in the chat, but if you have any specific questions to the panelists as to what they've already talked about, what they maybe haven't mentioned yet, please feel free to add your questions there, and we'll make sure we try and answer most of them as much as we can. So this kind of goes into our next question. Socrates and Salome laid out a really great framework for how protest movements begin and the triggering points in each part. But for the purposes of what HOA Pals wants to achieve in this space is that we also want to be able to make these connections, not just across the continent, but across the world. So we see these protests happening in Uganda and Nigeria. Interestingly enough, with the timing happening in the US and what Black people in America are facing, and people have been spending a lot of time these past few months drawing conclusions and making these analyses off of what that looks like for all Black people across the world, and not necessarily just in specific parts of the world. So my question to y'all is, how do y'all see these protests occurring in various areas in the US, in Europe, and how does that maybe seep into these movements happening on the ground in Africa? Is there any connection that you all can make? I am refraining from saying that the US or Black people in certain areas in the West are necessarily influencing these movements in Africa, because I wouldn't necessarily say that's the case. I think these are happening concurrently and always. And if anything, Africans have been protesting and fighting for independence for so long now. But can we see these connections? Is there any meaning or impact that can be made through these connections? Salome, if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, I can answer that. My response to this is a bit extensive, especially with my position in this construct called Atlanta, Georgia. So in many ways, I agree. I believe that movements by Black folks impact each other. They have for a long time. And this year is one example, along with many others. And so part of this is in organization and organizing. And I believe another part of it too is because the ways in which similar forms of state repression get used by movements globally, because similar to how, like, we're in communications with each other, but so too are the forces of domination, right? So in the case of Atlanta, the Atlanta Police Department has had a history of getting trained by the apartheid state of Israel, which has been true for Uganda police as well. The same type of training gets used and the same types of tear gas gets utilized to try to control movement, control fights against state repression. So these types of trainings have intensified further since AFRICOM, which stands for African Command Program. The program started at the end of the Bush administration, but was built up by the Obama administration. And the goal of the program is ultimately to repress any movements against US imperialism on the continent. So they have expanded US military bases throughout Africa. And in the Horn and Intercept report showed that in 2019, there were 11 bases, and one of them was in Entebbe, which is right by it's where the airport in Uganda, the main airport in Uganda, is located. So as far as the Black, like what I've seen this called by many folks, and particularly I'll name who coined it, but what they call as the Black misleadership class in Atlanta shows, the ways in which the police in Atlanta are Black, the mayor is Black, many members of the state house and Senate and several offices are Black. It's a very Black city. But as we've seen in the case of Uganda and even more recently South Africa, simply having Black people hold seats isn't necessarily enough if the foundation underneath is the same. They're still under the same system, a system that has been cultivated, especially in the US sense and in the South Africa sense, to maintain settler colonialism. So these same systems still leave Atlanta with some of the worst qualities of living outcomes, especially as it relates to housing. And this is in large part due to the system called gentrification, which is a byproduct of colonization, where state officials make deals to drive out poor Black folks out of their homes to make way for white and classed developers to take over. In an article entitled Killer Mike, T.I., and Black Misleadership Class, Devin Springer lays out the ways in which Black celebrities have been and continue to be utilized for state repression. When people are protesting and a window gets hit or a cop car burns, the Black misleadership class rushes to the pressers for the corporate media, CNN. They call the hitting of the windows, the burning of the cars, violence. They call that violence, but they do not, but not the fact that many Black neighborhoods in Atlanta suffer from food apartheid, nor that there are hella Black folks sleeping on the streets as home prices rise, nor that we are on stolen land. That is not claimed as violence. And part of that is because that's not their job. That's not their role. Even when they are Black, their job is to maintain capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all the systems of white domination while remaining quote unquote cool and palatable and, utilizing the language of the people and, coming up with music and doing all sorts of things. And that, Devin Springer actually in that article summarizes and brings forth the definition of Black misleadership, which is, I believe was coined by Glenn Ford, or at least defined in this way by Glenn Ford. But the Black misleadership is both an actual and aspirational class of political forces readily prepared to sell out the interest of the overwhelmingly working class Black masses for the sake of capitalist, corporate, and imperialist interest. Atlanta has repeatedly been tapping into the Black misleadership class as a tool for repression. Those in this class, no matter how much they care about Black folks, have class interests that are not aligned. For example, Killer Mike always talks about how much property he has in Atlanta. If you have this much property and you claim to care about Black folks, why are you not housing them? So that is like one example. And part of the Black misleadership class too is that they're so removed from material conditions of folks struggling day to day, but they still hold themselves up as the voice for the people. These are the sellouts. They were needed for colonialism, as Walter Rodney outlined in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and they are needed today to maintain neocolonialism and imperialism. And they show up in each movement. Black Lives Matter, they do their little posts, et cetera, without troubling their class position in any type of way. And so, yeah, that's all I want to say on that. It's a bit long.
Oh, awesome. No, that was incredible. Salome, thank you for that. And I'm not sure if Socrates was like running into an issue, so hopefully he can kind of join us again soon. But that was a great kind of perspective to bring in, especially on the Black misleadership class point. That was incredible and it continues to be relevant as we talk about the connections that we can make to the protests happening here and in Uganda and Nigeria and all over the world. So then that kind of goes into my next question about what the media's role looks like in all of this. What do you see their role in broadcasting the situation in these respective countries all over the world? I guess like what you see their role looking like versus what they actually look like. I'm curious for your perspective on how the media is responsible for a lot of this.
Yeah, so I personally don't try not to consume too much mass media, but it's kind of hard to avoid because it's everywhere in every corner, every scroll, everywhere. So when it comes to this particular issue that's been broadcast, it's been mainly painted as this is Museveni versus Bobby Wine issue, which is true, but it's also about state repression. But news outlets like CNN, Washington Post, et cetera, they're not going to point you to its connections with imperialism or how policing in Uganda in the first place, comes from this history of colonialism, because that would mean them also being exposed, because corporate media is very much, they're not there to tell the truth. It's part of the state building project. They're there to keep you entertained. Even if you think about what the media look like, even with, within a US context of the elections, right? Like they change based off of what they want the influence to be, from going when there were over 20 candidates to in like having some critique of Biden to completely shifting in order to change the public mindset. And the language used to, particularly with the Uganda protests, the language used to describe protesters was similar to what we've seen throughout the world. So official news houses throughout Uganda have referred to protesters as hooligans. This type of language takes us back to previous notions around violence, who is violated versus who is violating. So the response to state repression through protest gets the young folks labeled hooligan. In an interview or a podcast that I listened to with Jackie Kamigiza and Nia Mishana, they were talking about elections and police brutality in Uganda and referred to the hooligan question as a message that says hooligan equals thing that is not human, things that can be violated. They also pose the question of what this would have meant if rich Ugandans were being violated. And that kind of goes on to what, Socrates was talking about earlier about how NSARS really sparked, because it's like more middle-class folks as opposed to folks that have been historically economically exploited, which all of us are, but in very different ways through class structure. And so looking through large news media sites in Uganda, two that really caught my attention are the Daily Monitor and New Vision. I found statements such as, "The circumstances under which we lost those lives is really regrettable, and it would have been avoided if our officers had used tear gas to disperse the protesters. However, there is scientific investigation going on to establish which gunfires and live bullets. I can assure you those officers who did will be individually held accountable." And this is the type of language that's usually used with protests, right? So these types of statements, the call for accountability of the police by the police, paint the state and the police as redeemable, which they are not. And so as outlined through the history of colonial construct of Uganda, the police are accountable to the state, not those they murder. And believing in the police as redeemable leads to non-solutions like police oversight committees, as opposed to working to eradicate the entire system. Following the money trail for the New Vision group, it's owned by the Ugandan government. You don't need to dig too far. Even the Wikipedia page shows that it's owned by the Ugandan government, in addition to some individual investors. And then on the other side, the Daily Monitor, which is another major news source in Uganda, is reported as an independent news source, but their reporting on the protests still had the same tones as that of the government-owned New Vision news site. And so the police system, which includes the jails, are utilized as ways to control movement, and the media is also utilized in that way. And so one of the ways that even social media is utilized to control folks is the example of Stella Nyanzi, who Museveni imprisoned and put in jail for 18 months because she had a Facebook post that he felt insulted him, so therefore put her into prison. And another issue that I just want to highlight real quick is the issue of surveillance. And so 836 suspects in Uganda have been recently arrested due to the utilization of highway, it's from this company Highway, surveillance cameras, and they've been tracked down and arrested in those ways. So think about all the different modes of state repression through the media we consume, through the police, the physical police, through the jail, through even through these surveillance devices, is what I wanted to highlight.
Awesome, thank you for that. And thank you, welcome back, Socrates. We're glad you're able to get back on.
Yeah, sorry, my phone went off here. I thought I was
no worries. Oh, okay, no, you're good. So we're gonna you give some time for y'all to answer some questions in the Q&A. So far, we have 4 questions. So if anyone that is attending today would like to ask the panelists any questions, oh, we just got another one. Please continue putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we're gonna leave out some time after a few minutes after we answer these last questions. So kind of the two last questions that we have, and it's kind of hard, I know, to keep kind of your answers as short as possible, especially with these kind of questions. But how do we see politicians and their connections to foreign aid playing an important role in police brutality? Is there, especially also bringing in the nuance of what it looks like for activists to also somehow end up getting involved in the very thing that they are fighting against or protesting against? And how do you see that affecting movements? Socrates, if you'd like to answer that one.
Oh yeah, I'll keep this as short as possible. I remember talking to an activist who was once a student union president, and I asked him what's the difference between what's separates him as an activist, and he basically said an activist is anyone who speaks up about anything, but he classified himself as a revolutionary socialist. And for him, that puts it in perspective in the sense that he has an ideology that guides him. There is no way you can stop activists who are not guided by any ideology from becoming government tools. It happens. It's happened in South Africa. It's happened in Nigeria. It's happened in Zambia. It's happened everywhere. You know, I mean, the former freedom fighters are now the new oppressors. And that seems to be a cycle that doesn't need to stop. So unless you are a socialist revolutionary who is guided by that principle of being focused on bringing change and revolution to the people, then that can be the only thing that probably can guide you. But otherwise, it is something that would probably repeat itself. And I think it's also up to the people to not expect saviors, because I think that is one of the things. There's this savior syndrome that seems to be across the continent, where we are all waiting for this person to help us and get this person out. So the new savior, for example, in Uganda would be Bobby Wine. You know, the new savior in Nigeria is whoever seems to be playing the role of fighting against the oppressor. You know, forgetting that roles easily switch. And it's a system. And if you're not focused on the system, then there's probably no change that will happen. And that's why as a revolutionary socialist, you're focused on the system and bringing that system down and putting a new system in ground instead. You know, and yeah, basically, so unless we're addressing things in the roots or at the level of the root, then we are basically just pruning and pruning and pruning. And that's why many people thought Obama would bring change, but we saw what we saw. So yeah.
No, that's a really great answer, Socrates, and actually even speaks to Salome's earlier point about the Blackness leadership class, and that's really important to bring into. Salome, did you have any quick response to that?
Not particularly, but yeah,
Okay.
just like to highlight that there's this huge thing about like, oh, if we get Museveni out, we'll have Bobby Wine, but even then, it's like, what does that actually mean, considering the interconnected ties and having Uganda having been like the place in East Africa, right, in the Horn, where, you know, the military quote unquote aid that Museveni gets, he utilizes that to attack places like, to help with like repression and also in South Sudan, in Somalia, in Congo, in Rwanda, in Kenya. So that home for the colonial body, they're not gonna just let that go by replacing one person as opposed to destruction of the whole system, like Socrates mentioned.
Exactly. No, yeah, I think both of y'all actually really hit the nail on the head in terms of focusing more, not necessarily on the person that happens to be kind of leading these movements, and even then it usually is supposed to be the masses, but then rather giving more focus to the systems that are perpetuating these problems. So thank you for that. And I think Socrates is having technical difficulties, so hopefully he'll be back soon. Last question before we move on to our Q&A. So everyone, if you still would like to ask any questions, that is still open until we answer this last question. So we talked a lot about how these politicians, specifically individual politicians, perpetuate these systemic issues. We've talked a lot about like grasping and having a better understanding of the problems that we've faced of police brutality at the very root, and that has been incredible. We've had incredible conversation about the connections with economic problems that people may be facing, class struggle, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of everyone I know has been looking into these things and always asking at the end. I think that's our very nature as humans, is like, what can we do? What is the solution, the one solution, which, I mean, we can even unpack that and understand that that's not necessarily the case. But in however you would like to answer that question, Salome, how do you see what we could do in response to a lot of these problems that we're facing? And there's been talk about abolishing the police, abolishing AFRICOM. What does that look like to you? What do these solutions look like to you?
Yeah, there's plethora of solutions, because as we've even named in this session, like there's just so many arms at play and there's so much work to be done. And one of the key ways to do work is like in organization and in groups. And so like one great way, if you wanted to get involved, especially those who are from the Horn of Africa interested in Pan-Africanist politics, is joining a space like the HOA Pals. Another thing folks can do is utilize this moment as an invitation to rethink your relationship to the governments you're a part of, rethink your relationship to the lands you are on, and your relationships to each other. What can knowing our true histories and heroes collectively do, not just like on an individual level, but like as a collective? And then as we think about that, even specifically in the context of Uganda, we then can start asking questions like, okay, do we even need this nation state? You know, one of the things that folks always say is everyone should just come together and peace and all of that. But what does that actually mean, considering the very cultivation of these spaces, right? Can it get us to liberation given its colonial roots? What will happen if folks stop? What will happen if folks stop participating in these sham elections is a question that was asked on that podcast I mentioned earlier. And also, Dr. Tamale reminds us that the ideal of Pan-Africanism cannot be achieved within institutionalized coloniality of state politics. If we accept this truth, what new solutions, outside of the state can we come up with? For those of us in the States, it may mean thinking through with our people in the Horn of Africa and beyond about what it looks like within those contexts, right? For me, it would mean, what does abolitionist politics, what does it mean here within this context? Does it carry any weight? And how might it show up given the material conditions and the political and economic and social makeups? And we must ask each other these questions and try to actually do the work of making what we dream, come to fruition. And something that was also noted in the podcast is the need for, right now, there's a need for accountability mechanisms in Uganda. So with the protesters arrested, et cetera, right now, there's not really an accountability mechanism for each other between organizers. And so there's a need to provide legal aid, donations, et cetera. And they were particularly speaking to the importance of having mechanisms for support and for a safety net, because organizers have a responsibility to their bases and also each other. And so I guess to sum it up, like, there's no one single solution, and we can't really look at one person for a single solution. Like, we have to really continue studying this shit, learning it from the roots, and then working together with folks with shared politics and building political homes where, we could work to tackle these issues in various ways and in joyful ways as well. It does not have to be a daunting process 24/7.
Definitely. Thank you for that. I think that was a really great way for us to understand how we even go about answering that question. And Socrates, the question was, what do you view as solutions? And basically, what can we do as people wherever we are, in reference to the problems that we've talked about today? So if you'd like to answer that really quickly, we also have about 6 to 7 questions we have to get through, so just keep that in mind.
So solutions to what we're facing.
Yeah, so we talked a lot today about police violence. We've talked about economic violence and everything. And in response to movements that have been happening across the world, what do you see as solutions that we could potentially implement, or what can we do, whether that's literally doing something physically or learning more about the situation? What do you view as solutions?
That's such a huge question, to be honest. Because because the solutions still end up revolving around the same things that we're protesting against. Sometimes I would say if we're probably in a very dark hole we probably can't get ourselves out of. Currently the solution in Nigeria, for example, people are proposing, have state policing. Don't have a federal policing. So you have police that comes from various states. But we're seeing a resemblance of that. And then you find that this new set of so-called solution, can you hear me? Okay, you find that this new set of solution come up and say something like, if people dress skimpily, they would be punished. and then you start wondering to yourself, wait a minute, we are trying to solve a solution to police brutality. You are set up as, in quotes, some sort of alternative to that. And the next thing you're talking about is punishing people for dressing skimpily, which doesn't make sense. And then if that's the solution we're running towards, and that doesn't seem to be working, I could very well say the best solution is the dismantling of states. But that also doesn't seem to be an entire solution, because basically here we are. And what we seem to think of as state is ingrained in us. And even if, for example, because there has been let me just give this example, there's been the agitation of the Biafra state in Nigeria, where the Igbos want to be on their own. But does that mean that the same state structure, just like in South Sudan, does that mean that that won't still perpetuate itself in a new state? So could it be education? But you look at what is happening all over the world, and that doesn't seem to be the case. To be honest, I will be very honest. I don't know what the solution can be. I find myself constantly thinking about it. Is there any solution where women would be free? Is there any solution where, because it's all about power at the end of the day. It's all about power. It's all about, even if we have a free state, so to say, women will still be oppressed in that same free state. People in the LGBTQ community will still be oppressed in that same free state. So it has been.
Oh no, you might continue. You might be having more technical difficulties, but Socrates, hopefully whenever you come on, we can't necessarily hear you right now. But he provided some really great additional analysis than what Salome had mentioned. But I think what I'm really hearing from both of them is that systemic problems mean systemic solutions. Like, we have to think in a lot bigger than I feel like we find ourselves doing, which is like individual solutions. But thank you, Socrates, for making points. I don't know if you can hear us. And thank you, Salome, for making incredible points and answering these questions. So let's head on over to the Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left. So we'll be as brief as possible, but we'll also see if Salome and hopefully Socrates is willing to connect with anyone afterwards, and that could be talked about afterwards. All right. So the first question we have is, have former leaders like Jomo Kenyatta and Idi Amin, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing, influenced modern day police forces in Kenya and Uganda, respectively? That's really a question, Salome, that you're able to answer?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, almost every presidency in Uganda has been through some type of coup. And so whichever ethnicity really the person's most distant from or sees as a threat to their power, they usually build up structures and policing and militarization around repressing them so that that group does not overthrow them. In the case of Idi Amin, one of the groups he repressed were the Acholi folks, whose the documentary that I showed was highlighting parts of that genocide under Museveni, but some of that work had been carried out through Idi Amin's administration as well.
Awesome, thank you for that. And the next question is, and obviously you can kind of answer it from your perspective, has Nigeria or Uganda ever had any strong socialist movements?
I'm not sure about socialist, but the closest that that the state of Uganda, and when I say state of Uganda, I mean Museveni, I mean all of that, has come to being overthrown was actually shortly after the election in 1985-86, and it was through the Holy Spirit's movement of this woman named Alice Umalakwena, who utilized spiritual forces and other forms to mobilize like over 10,000 young folks to try to overthrow Museveni. And similar to how Museveni was able to stop her movement in Jinja, he did the same thing with Bobi Wine just a few weeks ago. But Bobi Wine's movement, it was very different than Alice Lakwena's movement. Alice Lakwena movement was a spiritual movement. It was a movement of rebellion, because she was tired. she's tired and her people were tired. So yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, that's incredible. And the next question, I guess I could ask this about, okay, so a person had asked, what could those of us moving as future professionals with these concerns in mind do to recognize such structures and continue to connect with others?
I don't know. I guess it means by what is meant by like professionals. Yeah, because as somebody who does not believe in work, like the type of work that we do to maintain capitalist systems, it depends on what is meant by professional. And so I think that'll help with clarifying.
Okay, so hopefully who answered that question can be able to give us more context to it, and we can get back to that. And we have a question in relation to the End Stars movement, but and even though Socrates is not here, I think this is still a good point to raise, and I'm curious for your perspective on this, Salome. So the question posed by Tyler was, one of the End Stars demands is increase in police salaries to deter violence. I know that defund is not as like a neatly applicable demand as it is in the US, given that the Nigerian police force is already defunded. But what are your thoughts and perspectives on that demand and the uniqueness of the abolition movement in Nigeria? But we can also connect this to Uganda, of course.
Any solution that requires giving more money, more equipment, etc., to the police just increases the harm that they're able to do. If we start from a viewpoint of, this is a violent institution in and of itself, then the only possible solution would be to work towards eradicating it. And yes, defunding it is like one of the ways, like within the context of Uganda, for example, I forgot the exact money line amount, but there's always a certain budgetary line that is within the Uganda budget that's specifically for like an extra budgetary line that is always for the military and militarization. And so I feel like there's always space to defund more. It's just like maybe redefining what defund means within the different contexts. And because I think context means everything, as somebody who is a historian and appreciates history, and like it all depends on context. And so how do we take that into account as we, work to eradicate the police, which is, I believe, the only real way to go about it.
Right. No, definitely. Socrates, thank you for coming back. So the question actually is specific to Nigeria. We just had Salome give another perspective on it too, but the question posed was about the demands, one of the demands being an increase in police salaries to deter violence. And the question was that using the word like defund police is not as applicable to the Nigerian police force because it's already defunded. But this person is curious on your thoughts and perspectives on that demand and the uniqueness of the abolition movement in Nigeria.
Yeah, that's a great question because, the Nigerian police keeps taking from you every single day, the Nigerian police kills people because of 15 naira. The Nigerian police has killed people because of 20 naira. Poor policemen, poor bus drivers who wouldn't probably give them a 20 naira bribe or tip or whatever it is qualified as. So when I saw that demand, it hit me. I was like, there's a funny demand. I don't know where the demand is coming from, but it doesn't really sit well with me. It's a demand that is based on, yes, the Nigerian police are paid poorly, but so are many Nigerians. And many Nigerians who are paid poorly are also not just going to the streets and taking up arms and saying, give me money or I'll kill you. Because what the Nigerian police has turned itself to is a professional kidnapping unit. That's what the Nigerian police has turned itself to. And you find that the Nigerian police would basically waylay young Nigerians and say, it's either your life or your money. So when I saw that demand for an increase in police salary, so what happens when other civil structures start asking for an increase in payments? because it's not only the Nigerian police that's paid poorly. In Nigeria, at least from what I know, many people who join the civil service, for the first 6 months, they're not paid. For the first 6 months. So how do those people survive? Do they start waylaying people on the streets and saying, give me money? So if you end up giving the police money, it's not an issue of money. And that's what you must understand. So these people who say, oh, you know, we must fund the police, it's not an issue of money, it's an issue of power. And the issue of, and the police, in fact, the inhumanity in the Nigerian police is such that when someone gets raped, they're so inhuman that you have to pay for the fuel to maybe even start doing anything at all. So it is a mentality issue first and foremost. They don't see themselves as policemen serving people. You know, that's the first issue. You know, if it was like, okay, let's pay for their psychiatric evaluation, I'll totally support that because they need to be psychiatrically evaluated first and foremost. But to say that we need to increase the fund, there will only be more corruption. And this is a country I know very well. I mean, that I have lived in, that I know very well. And I'm telling you, an increase in money. I'm sorry.
That was very funny, yeah.
But nothing's gonna change, man.
True. Money isn't necessarily the answer here, if anything. Thank you for bringing in that perspective, Socrates. I appreciate it. So we have two more questions wanting to be asked from one of our members, Philemon, here. So I'll let him go ahead and speak.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Salome, Socrates, just a wonderful presentation, and everybody's engaged here. I'm learning so much. But the key question I had, I think, is related to both countries. For Nigeria, we saw Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, out of nowhere, just tweet in support of one country police problems out of 1,000 within Africa. You know, considering their role in Libya and Haiti, how did the public view it in Nigeria? Second, I think it's related to Uganda because there's celebrities, major celebrities there as well. We saw within Nigeria, within the Nigeria diaspora celebrities, even within Nigeria, as far as celebrities pushing for sanction within when the NSARS went viral. There were some, I think they're Afro-pop celebrities. I'm not sure. He's pretty big. Another actor as well in the UK. I forgot his name. I think he was in Star Wars.
Was it Burna Boy?
Yeah, Burna Boy. It caused a lot of backlash, and the effectiveness of Nigerian activists and organizers put the pressure on him. He had to delete it. And this speaks to the volume of the strength of organizers and putting the pressure on that guy and the organizers in Nigeria. So these are the two questions. How do you view Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton involvement with the NSARS? And also, what is the view on supporting sanction, which is very harmful to African state? Another thing is, I'll just leave it at this. We're talking about abolishing the state, which is key, but I feel like as leftists or socialists or any other evolving term that you want to use for yourself, we have two challenging tasks ahead of ourselves as pushing abolition of the state, but at the same time, making sure that we have a functional state whenever we have a mass movement or a revolutionary government take over to defend itself toward imperialism, and also domestic reactionary. So how do you tackle the need to push this idea, hey, we definitely need to abolish the police, but at the same time, for the moment, there's a purpose for the state to function. How do you capture people's imagination? I know it's a full load question, sorry. That's it.
Socrates?
Let me know if I miss any one of those questions. Let me start with Burna Boy, yeah? First and foremost, I mean, I don't expect anything entirely critical from any celebrity, to be honest. I think we expect too much from them. They are not thought leaders. They are not, I don't know what books they read. Probably few of them read anything at all. So, so the way it works in Nigeria is the enemy of your enemy is my friend kind of thing. and nobody gives a fuck. Am I allowed to swear here? But nobody cares about Hillary Clinton and what she has done in Haiti or wherever else she has, whatever else she has done. You know, the end goal of Nigerians is, as far as NSAS is getting that, as long as Hillary Clinton is talking about the NSAS and this is getting that, in quotes, international appeal, so to say, you know, and that is now registered as a win, because I mean, to be honest, having critical discussions in the Nigerian internet space is a bit difficult. So we go for the cheap wins, to be very honest. And one of those cheap wins is Hillary Clinton. Oh, Hillary Clinton tweeted in support of NSAS. But you look at Hillary Clinton and you look at what has happened in Libya, look at AFRICOM, for example, you look at many of these things, and you're just like, I mean, for me, as I said, and this is what I have been saying consequently during the whole NSAS protest, see, we Nigerians should consider ourselves as our own salvation. We don't even need to go to Hong Kong and compare our movement with Hong Kong. No, the closest we can compare ourselves with is Sudan, because everything that's happened in Sudan is basically what we can compare ourselves with here in Nigeria. The Sudanese saved themselves, to put it that way. They died in their numbers, but they also saved themselves because they understood that no country would do anything. And so therefore, there seems to be a need to educate and re-educate Nigerians about, first and foremost, the role of countries like America, for example, in a country like Congo, in the role of America in the murder of Lumumba, for example. And this is not something that you find probably many Nigerians talking about. So it is just a cheap win. Oh, Hillary Clinton tweeted about NSAS, and we are so much happy about it, but we're not critical about what it is. Because if the NSAS movement becomes something more violent than it is, are we gonna say that, are we still gonna have the same support that Hillary Clinton gave to us when things become an issue of interest and not an issue of humanity? Because America has always operated from an issue of interest. You know, that is one of those things. So, I mean, that is, you know, the issue of sanctions is something that also people are not critically thinking about. Of course, there's been the argument that, oh, this is sanctions against individuals. That has been the major argument, because people forget that the same sanctions that are happening in Zimbabwe are hurting Zimbabweans till today. You know, of course, many Zimbabweans will probably give other arguments and counter arguments and all that. But we also have to understand how sanctions also work. Because when Abacha killed the Ogoni 9, there was no damn sanction. Nobody cared about anything. So you have to understand how these people think. But many Nigerians will not sit down to think about how these people think. It is just a cheap win. Oh, the sanctions are going on. Oh, they're talking about NSAS in the British Parliament. Oh, Hillary Clinton is talking about NSAS. And those cheap wins are not translated into anything serious. And it also shows you a reflection of how much, unfortunately, how much the revolution can go deeply in Nigeria. I saw someone talk about the socialist movement in Nigeria, and the socialist movement in Nigeria has actually been in existence for a very, very long time, but it just seems to not have gotten to the mainstream right now. And this is actually a good time for it to get to the mainstream, not just ideologically, but also in changing how people also critically reevaluate so many things in relation to power and struggle, and in relation to, you know, the issue of someone like Hillary Clinton commenting on the NSAS protest. Because you also look at the role of Britain in the Nigerian Civil War, you look at the role of Russia in the Nigerian Civil War, you look at the role of Britain in apartheid South Africa, and from there, before it happens to you as a country, as a nation, Nigeria, you can already deduct and say that this is what is happening in these various countries. These are the positions America has taken as a country. And therefore, if, as Nigerians say, water pass Gary, if water becomes more than the Gary, if things come to the worst, we will be left on our own, and we'll be left to defend ourselves. So until Nigerians are able to say that this is our own battle regardless, and understand that we have, peculiarly, I mean, apart from many other African countries, we have a high number of Nigerian diaspora who can externalize the struggle, then we will probably not get to be very much deeply needed change and not cosmetic change that we need. So I don't know if I've answered your question totally, Philemon.
That was great. That was great.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess Salome, that's
Yeah,
the
so
same question.
it's just a cosmetic victory for many Nigerians. The fact that Hillary Clinton is commenting about NSAS is just a very cosmetic victory. But many Nigerians see it as this very huge thing, and they forget that if things are to become worse than they are, America will still take its normal position.
Okay, yeah, I can answer this to some degrees. I think part of a praise of Clinton tweeting anything kind of speaks to how liberalism functions. And so I'll highlight it, not necessarily in the case of Libya and Haiti, which is more documented, but more in the case of South Sudan, which is less documented and less widely spread out. And so in 2016, Intercept report by Nick Turse, it outlines how Hillary Clinton under the Obama administration aided militaries in South Sudan. So in 2008, the US passed legislation called the Child Soldier Prevention Act, which banned them providing quote unquote military assistance to countries with child soldiers. In order to bypass this legislation and continue funding Salva Kiir, the White House issued annual waivers since South Sudan's independence in 2011 so that they can continue providing military quote unquote aid, which is like equipment, trainings, etc., to Salva Kiir's military so that he can continue ultimately killing South Sudanese folks that he sees as a threat to his power. So this funding added up to $620 million in US assistance in 2012. And in 2013, the US aid topped out more than $556 million. And that September, Obama issued another waiver, this time in the form of a memorandum to the Secretary of State. And those of us that are from South Sudan who still have family there know that these millions and millions of dollars given to Salva Kiir by the US government, it's utilized to kill our own people. The relevance to Uganda is increased military aid leads to increased militarization. This increased militarization forced most South Sudanese, especially in the southernmost regions, back to Uganda refugee camps. And foreign policy reports show that US-Uganda military partnership dates back to the administration of Hillary Clinton's husband, Bill Clinton, who used Uganda as a conduit for military aid to rebels in southern Sudan battling the government in Khartoum, even before South Sudan became South Sudan. Knowing this history, Hillary Clinton calling Buhari, the Nigerian government, to stop the killings of young Nigerians is aligned with liberal politics. Like they'll post one thing on Twitter or make a nicely wrapped speech, like Obama's really known for his nice speeches, while literally killing Black and brown people. It is not an accident, it is by design. They are made palatable by the media, etc. But when you look at the records are not that difficult to find, especially if you're based in the States. You can easily find the ways in which they are a threat to our very well-being. I answered part of your question, but that's because it's 2:12.
Oh, that was great.
Was there a technical difficulty still?
Yeah, I think Yolanda is on mute.
Okay. I don't see them here, but do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, I mean, to just follow along, has there been any demands for sanctions, or has there been conversation on the harm and impact on sanctions, like what Socrates mentioned in Uganda?
like when it comes to sanctions, it's like, it's complicated, especially with Uganda, because, you know, like with Museveni's presidency, they're not really gonna do too much with them. But in the case of like, yeah, it's like a much more difficult question to answer, and something that I have to think about more.
Okay. Just last question, as far as Bobby Wine, I didn't realize he was really close with there was even an image with him attending a U.S. Embassy event, and he was close with the former U.S. ambassador. And also, it seemed like he said some controversial takes in the past as far as within the queer community and the harm that he has very conservative views in the past. So do you think it's dangerous, and there's interest for him to be centered within this mass movement, which delegitimize the other issue of class and other problems within Uganda that's very complicated, as you mentioned? Do you think centering Bobby Wine like this is an issue, given his politics and his closeness with the U.S. Embassy?
Yeah. And part of my spark for the hesitation with Bobby Wine too is that, you know, like if, you know, anybody who's elected is willing, he's met with a U.S. representative in order to try to get, you know, get Museveni to stop doing what he's doing. But that type of, even sitting down with an elected official in the US shows some level of hope in the US system, shows some level of that like it's possible for the US to help Uganda in any type of way, given the long legacy. And so that makes me a bit hesitant. And also, what makes me hesitant overall when it comes to presidencies, no matter where it is this thing of believing that, okay, if this person comes in, even if their politics aren't always aligned, et cetera, that, you know, things are going to be different. And maybe they are a little bit different, et cetera, but like the roots are still there. So whatever difference you perceive, especially if you're somebody who's classed, who, you know, whose material needs are met, those don't necessarily last for too long.
That's great. It looks like Yolanda is having technical difficulties with her mic. Let's see.
I think someone is asking about, someone is asking about a Ugandan ritual called Mato Oput, used to unify, whether it's still in practice. It's on the chart.
Yeah, Mato Oput is it's like an Acholi like form of communal justice. And so if we're thinking about solutions outside of the state, like Acholi folks have like a lot of different cultural ways in which we tend to community injustice. And Mato Oput Mato Oput works because, and it still works, and it's still utilized to this day in different ways and forms, dependent on which Acholi, which region of Acholi land a person's from. But part of why it works is because it's by folks who are in community with one another and accountable to one another in one way or another. And so that type of ceremony, to utilize it as like a state tool for justice wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense, because the state is not accountable to the people. And so that's a form of justice that does not rely on police or prisons or any of these institutions.
Thank you, Salome. As we wrap up, Yolanda is still having technical difficulties, but any last statement or comment you want to give to the audience before we end this? Okay, guys, well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Like Yolanda mentioned, it's available on your YouTube channel for anybody to review. Just follow our Twitter account, Facebook, and we'll definitely have more future panels like these to further push you to question liberal ideology and just more look at the situation within our continent from an anti-imperialist lens, and also understanding the Pan-African tradition as well. Thanks, Salome. Thanks, Socrates. Sorry about that, Yolan. I know you had some issues. But thank you very much. This has been great. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Yolan, for moderating. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask, is there any question maybe when I went off that I might have missed that needed to be answered?
Yeah, is there a way we can send it to you directly, or?
If we still have little time, 3 minutes, 2 minutes left, I could quickly.
Let's see. Yeah,
I was having issues with my, this is Nigeria. I was having issues with network.
Yeah, I mean, you answered the question about the salary increase, and that was the point.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
And then the issue of the Nigerian celebrity and Bill Clinton. Yeah, those are key questions.
So, someone said, do we need to redefine what independence means for African states because of still dependent on global capitalism and colonial leadership?
Yeah, we can carry this conversation.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, Socrates.
Yeah, no problem.
But yeah, appreciate it, Salome, Socrates. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining our panel. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Bye. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thanks.